Very special thanks once again to Affordable Prestige Cars in Glastonbury. As always, they are a pleasure to work with, and if you've checked out my previous reviews, you can tell the kind of stuff that they have in stock. If though you are new to the channel, be sure to slap the link down in the video description to see what they've currently got for sale, and they have some very, very nice cars in their inventory, from Jaguars to Bentleys to Mercs to Rolls Royces, all of which are much more affordable than you might think. My thoughts and expectations going into this particular review were pretty simple, and the reason why is because I thought it was a simple equation. You take essentially the two other Jags from affordable prestige cars which I've already reviewed, put them together, and surely you get this. See, the first one which I reviewed was one of my favourite cars I've driven so far, the Jaguar XKR. I want one as my next car, in fact. It's a fantastic super saloon. Then on the other hand, you take the much lower down the market but still fantastic XK Coupe from around 2007. That car is a superb GT, especially for its price range of under 10 grand. Well, if you take those two and put them together, surely you get this. It has the look, the category, the style of an XK, but with the heart and soul and even some of the styling cues such as the rims and the quad exhausts and the bonnet of that XFR. It's a simple equation, but here's the funny thing. It's nothing like that. See, it's a lot more sedate for a start than I would have ever expected this car to be. In fact, despite sharing the essentially exact same engine as that XFR, a 5-litre supercharged V8, 503 horsepower, 460 pound-feet of torque, and even having similar performance, 4.6 seconds to 60, limited of course to 155, well, across the board it sounds like a pretty good comparison so far. So why am I saying that my equation was wrong? Well, I'm not exactly sure why, because in a couple of key ways. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to say that this car falls a little bit short of the other two. Now, I want to back that up by saying that I believe this is a great car in its own way. There are certain key points though, certain specific specs, if you will, about both the XK and the XFR, which make this one seem less impressive. And I'm going to run through those just for full transparency before we get into some of the great things about this car. First of all, let's compare it to the XK. That is a brilliant GT, and the key reason is the price. This car, put simply, doesn't have that same advantage. One is that, of course, it's an XKR, not an XK, so by definition, you would expect it to be more expensive. The second and more crucial thing, though, is it's the last XKR. 2014 was the end of this era, and there were no more XKs afterward, because of course we now have the F-Type. Now, my thoughts on the F-Type are actually crucial to this review, so I'm going to come back to that later on. For now, though, let's go back to those comparisons, because yes, it's justified in having a higher price, but that still means that I cannot praise this car as much as the XK because it simply isn't as affordable and therefore doesn't have that advantage. This car, for example, is more like 27 grand in comparison to the 7 or 8 grand that you can buy an XK for. That is a massive difference. Now compare it to the XFR. That, on its own right, was a 13 grand car, so still half the price of this machine. For a similar age, in fact, a couple of years older, but of course beyond the obvious advantages in practicality, which you can put to one side because, let's be honest, most GT buyers probably don't care too much, because otherwise they just buy a super saloon. Let's talk to something more technically interesting. And that is once again something to do with practicality, but not to do with space. I'm not talking about doors or seats or trunk space. I'm actually talking about fuel economy. Now again, you could say, I don't care about fuel economy. It's a super sports car. I'm just buying it to be fast and fun. That's all well and good. But still hear me out, because this is quite strange. See, they share the same engine, they're from the same era, they even have similar performance. You would assume safely that the XKR is probably a little bit lighter than the XFR, and surely it's got to be more aerodynamic. But here's the thing. the fuel economy is massively different between the two. In fact, this car on the highway only does around 20 to the gallon. The XFR can do 32 to the gallon on the highway, and even around town, the XFR is still superior. That doesn't make too much sense to me. But there is one way in which that might make sense, and that is if they have different gear ratios. Now, I haven't looked fully into that, so that is possible, but that's the only real difference that would make sense of why the fuel economy would be so different on the two cars, given that they have the same power, they're both heavy, they're both large, they're even both from the same manufacturer, so that is a massive difference in miles per gallon. And because of that, of course, it also makes a difference to the total fuel range to a tank, not just per gallon. Now again, like I said, some people might not care at all about that, but considering that a Super GT car is essentially going to be a long-distance performance vehicle, it is something that you might want to keep in mind. However, now let's get into the good points. Well, performance is fantastic. Of course, as you could hear from the start of the video, the engine sings, or rather roars in this case. It has all of that great performance that the XFR would have. As I said, you're looking at about 4.6 seconds to 60. It's probably a little bit quicker than that in practice though. Manufacturers tend to undersell that kind of stuff, and if you remove the limiter, I have no doubt that this could do over 180 miles an hour pretty comfortably. Now of course there are even quicker ones, you've got your XKRSs, even the GT version, but to me I've actually never liked those as much. I get why people do. Even in the case of the XFRS, I don't like it as much. I find them a little bit over the top. I like the more understated, elegant side of Jaguar, for me personally at least, and this one is kind of the top of that particular tree. Now let's go to something else which I love. The interior. Now for me, the outside of the car is kind of a toss-up. See, I prefer the look of the earlier XK, even though it doesn't have the extra intakes, it doesn't have quad exhausts, or the boot spoiler isn't as large, but I actually kind of like that. I like the understated elegance of that 2007 era, but from the inside, there's no comparison. This car is definitely superior, and one of the reasons why I like it is because it shares a lot in common with that XFR. It has, for instance, that rise-up gear selector, which is kind of a left and right twist knob rather than a click-clunk into place traditional gearbox. The paddles are more ergonomic on this car than the older one, and even the rest of the interior design, it has much more in common with the XFR than it does with the older XK. You would hope so, and for me at least, this is one occasion where the interior of the XK finally matches up to how good the outside looks, whereas on the older car, to me at least, I like the outside of the XK from around 2007 a lot more than the inside. I think it's aged better, let's say, from the outside. The interior is more like an old school Jag to me, which isn't bad, it's just not quite as exciting. Now though, let's bring it back for just a second to comparisons, because this is a crucial thing, I believe, in this discussion. This not only ties into my other Jaguar reviews, but also to my Aston Martin reviews, in particular my review of the 2014 Vantage Roadster. Same year of car as this one, and just like this Jaguar, it was the end of an era for Aston Martin. So why am I comparing the two? Am I saying that you should buy the Aston Martin instead? Well, no, not necessarily. This comparison has more to do with the metaphorical side of things. See, as I said in that review, the reason why I wanted to review that Vantage is because it was the end of the era. The newer Vantage, the current Astons in other words, to me have a lot to love, but they're also very different to what they used to be in the 2000s and earlier 2010s. To me, they have more of a chunky, kind of compact, muscular, brutish look to them, but they're not quite as elegant and as classy as the older Astons like the DBS, the Rapide, the Vanquish, etc., to me at least. For me though, it's the same with Jag. See, of course, the F-Type replaced the XK range, including the XKR, obviously, and I get similar vibes from the F-Type as I do with the Aston Vantage. It's chunkier, looks more compact, has more of a muscular kind of Euro muscle stance to it, and I love all of that. It's louder, it's bigger, brasher, more of a bruiser, but to me at least it doesn't have the elegance. And that comparison is where things get interesting. See, in my opinion, if you are considering this car, you might not necessarily need to look at an Aston, because for an equivalent era Aston, such as the one that I reviewed, It's almost double the price, so it's not really that much of a comparison. However, if you compare this within Jaguar, there are two cars in particular which I think you should look at as well. One is newer and one is older. Now the newer one I've already mentioned, and that is the F-Type. To get an F-Type for a similar price range though, chances are you'll probably have to go for a slightly lower model in the range, whereas this is the higher model in the XK range. Not the highest, but a higher one. Now on the other hand, I'm going to make a comparison that you might not expect. The older XKR, in particular the same generation of XKR that I drove the XK from around 2007. That version, instead of the 5-litre supercharged V8, has a 4.2-litre V8. Of course it's slower, it's less powerful, but slow it certainly isn't, it's just not as quick as this one. The reason why I suggest looking into that car as well is because even though that one is more expensive than the XK, it's still more affordable than this one, but offers a whole lot of car for the money. Now I know most people probably won't want to look to an older one, but I would encourage you to keep your mind open to that possibility, because just like that older XK, you get so much car for the money and then have even more cash left over potentially, and you could end up having just as much fun in it without necessarily spending as much money. The reason why this car costs more is not just because of its age, but because of what it represents. Being the end of the XK era is a hugely significant thing. So for the right buyer, it's absolutely going to be worth it. It's got great performance, it looks fantastic, it sounds great, it's comfortable, and in terms of the interior space and stuff like that, of course it's going to be at least as good as the XK because it's the same car. However, if you're looking more for a performance bargain, well then I would actually suggest looking to the previous generation. Between this and an F-Type though, I know which one I'd go for, because I'm more of a sucker for elegance, the more long-distance style, so for me it would have to be an XKR. It's still an interesting comparison to keep in mind though, so before you make a choice, I would recommend trying all three of those. The previous XKR, this XKR, and perhaps even a newer, slightly lower grade F-Type. But overall, that's it for my thoughts. If you are an XKR owner, this generation, maybe a previous one, tell me your thoughts down below. And if you're in the market, tell me your thoughts, drop questions down below, etc. And of course, if you're new to the channel, be sure to check out my other reviews, including the cars that I mentioned, such as the Aston Martin. And if you do decide to subscribe, be sure to hit the notification bell as well, so that you actually see my latest videos. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.